Hey guys, how we doing? Continuing on in our journey through the scriptures. Once again, this is a video that I have made in advance. We are still waiting on the baby to arrive. We had an appointment at our OB yesterday, and so far they didn't see any signs that she had clearly entered into labor, or at least not the stages of labor at which you really start to prepare for the coming of the baby. So we're still just getting everything done that we can, knocking out all the things that we can. I'm trying to finish up as many things as I possibly can, so that I can be very ahead. So I'm taking some time off when the baby arrives. I've been slowing my schedule down over the past month or so, just kind of in preparation for the coming of the baby, to have a little more time to build things and stuff like that for the baby and so forth. But once the baby comes, I'm actually taking some time just literally off, which those of you who go to my church, those of you who know me, that's just not really natural for me. I'm just not really like a time off guy. I'm not really a vacation guy. I'm not really anything like that. That's one of the reasons why just the biblical practice, the spiritual discipline of Sabbathing, the spiritual discipline of rest is one of the ones that I struggle with more than any other. But yeah, so in the several weeks that come after the baby is born, I'm not preaching any of the weeks of September, even though now it's when you're watching this, it's almost the end of September, but when I'm making this, it's the very, very beginning of September. Since I'm just making it in advance, I'm not having the meetings that I typically have. I'm not leading the different things that I typically lead, and so on and so forth. I'm still going to, keep up with everybody, just because, I have a relationship with the people in the church and connected to the church, and not taking I'm not taking September off of relationships, but yeah, so I'm taking some time off. I'm not going to be doing most of the things that I typically do, just so that we have more time to really, really lean in and invest in the baby during the first month of his life. And so I'm making as many of these as I can just ahead of time each morning. And if I have to go run an errand on my own, I'll just knock out a little bit of it in the car and stuff. And so I'm trying to finish all of these before the baby comes, which might be realistic, since the baby is really taking his sweet time. He's now, this is 6 days past his due date. So, the clock's ticking, right? If he hasn't begun the process of coming on out by September 11th at the end of the day, we have an induction scheduled for then, but we're trying, as hard as we can to avoid having to induce. I'm saying all this, I don't know what happened, but by the time you're watching this, by the time this is actually up, you'll already know what happened. You'll already know whether he came naturally, whether he had to be induced, whether, all these different things, whether it was a short labor, long labor, whatever. So you know a bunch of things that right now I do not. But I'm going to go ahead and just lay out as much as I possibly can of the book of Colossians. We're at the very least going to introduce what is going on that leads Paul to write the book of Colossians. And while we're doing that, I'm going to be making breakfast. So the important thing that we need to understand about Colossians is that Paul is writing to the church in Colossae. Now, as always, when I say the church in Colossae, I'm actually talking about a network of house churches. There were a bunch of churches that met just in people's homes. That was the norm in the first century. We've talked about how some churches met with their synagogues, right? Sometimes essentially an entire synagogue would come to faith, and that synagogue would become, for lack of a better word, like a Jesus synagogue, or like a messianic synagogue. And so some churches literally, they gathered in the synagogues each week. There would be a normal synagogue service with the normal Jewish liturgy on the Jewish Sabbath, and then on Sunday morning, there would be specifically a gathering of believers who would, it's like they would have kind of a unique worship service that was specifically directed around Jesus. Now, the Sabbath day service would also have been centered on Jesus, but there was this interesting thing that we saw happening in the first century. We actually see it as early as Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 20, and so on and so forth. You see them gradually kind of shifting the day where they gather for worship, sort of their central day of worship, from the Jewish Sabbath to Sunday. So the idea that like Constantine changed the day of worship to Sunday, that's a myth. The idea that the Roman government changed it to Sunday, or that the Catholic Church changed it to Sunday, that's a myth. There's a myth that goes around that says that the Catholic Church moved the day of worship to Sunday because that was the day that the Romans worshiped the sun god and other stuff like that. That actually had nothing to do with why the shift to Sunday happened. The shift to Sunday, as far as we can tell, there's unfortunately there's not a passage in Scripture that just says, here's why we started gathering on Sundays. There's also not like an obvious explanation in any of the early church fathers. These are like the men who were discipled by the apostles, and then discipled by the disciples of the apostles, and then discipled by the disciples of the apostles, and so on. And so the earliest church fathers, often they'll actually talk about things they literally heard from the apostles and stuff like that. And so they can be really, really helpful for helping us understand what's going on in some of the biblical books. But all that is to say, we don't have any clear explanations from the writings of the church fathers that we have right now to be able to explain that, kind of the earliest Christians to explain. But the answer seems to be that they shifted the day of worship to Sunday rather than the Jewish Sabbath, kind of the overnight from Friday evening through Saturday evening. They shifted it to Sunday morning specifically because on Sunday morning, Jesus rose from the dead. And when we gather each week to serve and worship the Lord together in our worship services, we are worshiping not just the idea of Jesus, we are worshiping the risen Jesus. We are celebrating the gloriously good news that the Messiah has risen from the dead. He has confirmed that he is who he says he is. He has demonstrated that he has defeated the powers of darkness. He has defeated death and sin, and he will put everything right. Again, he will redeem humanity and restore the world. And we can know that because of his resurrection. We can know that because he overcame the grave. And if he can overcome the grave, we can trust him when he says he will overcome all other things. And so some churches gathered in the synagogues on Sunday mornings. If the synagogue had broadly come to faith in King Jesus, some of them just met in houses in Jerusalem. Some of them actually, they would meet each week in the temple. They would meet in Solomon's colonnade in the temple. That was kind of almost like an auditorium space within the temple that different groups would use for different things. They would sometimes meet in like amphitheaters if there was one available that they could use, and so on and so forth. Sometimes just in kind of open spaces if there was a really large kind of courtyard and things. A lot of times the churches would gather all together, so there'd be hundreds of Christians just gathered together in a city in either a synagogue or like the temple colonnade or an amphitheater or a lecture hall or something else like that. And they would do that all together. And then during the week, they would gather together with the people in their house church. And so it was almost like there was the large group gathering, like what we do at my church at 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings. And then they would have throughout the rest of the week, the smaller group gatherings in their house churches where there's maybe 10, 15, 20 people max. And so it's kind of funny actually. So we've tried in the church that I'm a pastor of to sort of do all of this together on Sunday mornings. It would actually be ideal to have our service on Sunday mornings and then have our community groups during the week. But right now, for practicality's sake, for simplicity's sake, we're having our services at about 10 and our community groups at about 11. But it's like we're doing Acts chapter 2. It says they would meet all together in the colonnade, and then they would gather in their houses. They would meet as a congregation and as a community group. They would meet all together and from house to house. They would meet primarily for worship and to learn, and then they would meet primarily to worship and to fellowship over here. But whatever the case, it could look a little different from one city to the next. But Colossae would have been like any other church. The church in Colossae was a network of house churches. They would have gathered all together at once whenever they could. But ironically, this is the opposite of how we tend to think of it today in the modern church. In America, at least, we tend to think, okay, the most important thing is for me to get there for preaching. And that's what we usually call kind of the large gathered service, preaching. We say, I'll be there for preaching. I don't know if I can make community groups. I got to go do a thing. In the ancient church, in the first century, the earliest churches, you would gather together all as one big group when you could, as much as you could, as often as you could. You do your best to make it happen. But some weeks you just wouldn't be able to make it happen. Some weeks it just wouldn't be possible. Some weeks you can't use the colonnade. Some weeks you can't use the amphitheater. Some weeks you can't use the courtyard. Some weeks there's just nowhere you can safely gather hundreds of people together. But you could always gather from house to house. You could always gather in the house of one of the leaders, one of the elders at the church. And so ironically, in the first century church, it was the other way around. Sometimes you'd get to do preaching, but you would always do, for lack of a better word, your community groups. And so they were kind of community group centered, not preaching centered. But in the Colossian church, they're in this heavily pagan region. Colossae was just heavily paganized. It was an overwhelmingly pagan cultural context that they found themselves in. They are a network of house churches surrounded by pagans. And just like in Ephesus, just like in Philippi, just like in so many other places, the pagans there saw their refusal to worship the pagan gods, their refusal to worship Caesar, the emperor of Rome, their refusal to worship all the different false gods, false deities, and so forth of the Roman Empire, and Colossae in particular, as subterfuge, as disloyalty, as a lack of patriotism. You remember, it was like 10 years ago, there was a football player named Colin Kaepernick who he kneeled during the Pledge of Allegiance. It was like a protest statement that he was making. And some people were super into it. Some people just, it infuriated them, right? It struck them as just downright treasonous not to stand when the flag is being saluted and stuff like that. Imagine that cranked by a million, right? If you did not worship Caesar, they saw you kind of the way that your Fox News uncle saw Colin Kaepernick, but just cranked to 11. If you did not worship the local gods of Colossae, they saw you very similarly to the way that they saw like Colin Kaepernick or something like that. Or maybe if you have some like Jehovah's Witness friends, or if you have some like brethren friends or something along those lines, a lot of times they believe that to pledge allegiance to a country is idolatrous. To pledge allegiance to a flag is idolatrous. That these things this is a kind of allegiance that really only rightly belongs to Jesus. That's sort of what they believe. I think it's a little more complicated than that. We'll get into all of that sometime down the line. Maybe in First Peter when he talks about honor the emperor and other stuff like that. Maybe we'll get to it there, or maybe it'll come sooner. But the point is, they saw this the same way a lot of people see folks who don't want to say the Pledge of Allegiance, don't want to sing the national anthem, don't want to, other stuff like that. For them, God and country were completely intermixed, to the point that literally the emperor of the Roman Empire was sort of the central God that you were expected and required to worship, which was a problem for Christians, and it was a problem for Jews, because both Jews and Christians said, no, there is only one God. Yahweh is God. Caesar is not. Yahweh is God. In Ephesus, they would say Artemis is not. Yahweh is God. In Colossae, they would say the gods of Colossae are not. The gods of Philippi are not. The gods of Ephesus are not. The gods of Corinth are not. And that was the worst possible thing that you could say in that time and place and culture. They did not mind you saying Yahweh is God. That was fine. You can worship Yahweh. But you could not say Caesar is not. That was considered seditious. That was considered rebellious. That was considered revolutionary. If you said Caesar is not a god, it was tantamount to saying, let's overthrow the government. It was tantamount to saying, let's secede from the Union. Now, you weren't literally saying that, but that's the way that the Romans heard it. The Romans basically saw it. Either you worship Caesar as a god, or we cannot trust you not to turn into a revolutionary terrorist group. Now, that was not an insane thing for the Romans to think. We've talked about how there were the Zealots, there were the Sicarii, there were so many other extremist revolutionary groups, insurrectionist groups in first century Israel who literally wanted to overthrow the Roman government and create kind of an Israelite empire, an Israelite theocracy, force everybody else throughout the world to either worship Yahweh or be enslaved to Israel and so on and so forth. And so that sort of thing did exist. The Romans weren't insane, but they were so trigger happy trying to crush potential revolutionary groups that they ended up actually creating a bunch of revolutionary groups. They would seize people's land on a moment's notice if they believed that they might have some anti-Roman tendencies. They would just immediately torture people if they thought they might have some revolutionary tendencies. They would immediately just kill whole families if they thought you might have some insurrectionist tendencies. And ironically, a whole lot of people in first century Israel who probably started off just wanting to live their lives, eventually you watch a whole bunch of people who have nothing to do with any of this, getting their land taken from them, getting beaten and tortured, getting raped and violated, and then whole families just getting wiped out on suspicion that really has no basis, it starts to radicalize you, right? I mean, heck, every year when I get my property tax bill, it halfway radicalizes me. I'm like, why am I paying rent to the government to be allowed to live on land that I own, right? And that's a relatively mild thing. So imagine how it would affect you to watch the Roman government come through and just cut down seemingly anybody who doesn't show them a kind of religious devotion. That would honestly maybe drive you insane. And I mean literally, right? That would maybe turn you into kind of a nut job. That could awaken violent tendencies in you, violent impulses in you, and so forth. And so in the first century nation of Israel, the territory that used to be the nation of Israel, right, that was now just a kind of a colony for Rome, there was all of this vicious revolutionary fervor because the people had just had enough. A lot of modern Americans complain because their income tax they think is a little too high. A lot of people, they just kind of idly talk about like, oh, we need another 1776, blah blah blah, because this or that or whatever. And yet the reality is that as frustrating as our country can be, as frustrating as our government can be, as frustrating as all of these different things can be, there are plenty of things that need to be changed. There are plenty of things that need to be fixed, and we need to do that. We need to be serious about changing, fixing, all those things. But when you look at the big picture throughout history, we live in a remarkably stable, remarkably safe, remarkably free, remarkably wealthy, remarkably good country. And trying to just light everything on fire and start from scratch is way more likely to make things vastly worse than it is to make things even a little bit better. That is true regardless of which party is in office. Because the norm throughout human history, even up to the modern day, the norm is not freedom and then bad actors just take it away. The norm is chaos. And it takes a pretty good system to bring chaos into the kind of order that makes it possible to thrive. The norm is tyranny. And it takes a pretty good system to make it harder to get away with and maintain tyranny. The norm is absolutely unlivable situations. And it takes a pretty good system to bring everything together in a way that is not perfect but is livable. We have had for a very long time a system that of course is not perfect, but is livable for most people. And that's pretty good. We should not assume that taking a jackhammer to everything is going to make things better. We should assume taking a jackhammer to everything is going to make things worse. We should be very, very deliberate, very careful, very conscientious, cautious, and slow and steady, sober-minded about making changes incrementally, one thing at a time. But all that is to say, the government that the Colossians and the rest of the first century Christians and Jews were living under was wildly different from what we're experiencing. So you cannot read our situation into what Paul says here. When Paul talks about the pressure that they're facing from the pagans around them and the pagan government and so forth, it is fundamentally different than what we are experiencing now. There are principles here that apply to our modern day, and we need to take them and we need to apply them. But the situation is wildly different, both in just category and in degree. But the Colossian house church network is living in this heavily pagan region, Colossae, and they are under extreme cultural pressure to turn away from Jesus and to return to pagan gods, pagan mindsets, pagan lifestyles, pagan attitudes. The Roman government is pouring out relentless persecution on them and is saying, hey, we'll knock this off if you'll just worship Caesar. Hey, we'll knock this off if you'll just embrace the Roman gods like everybody else does. Be a good Roman citizen again. Hey, we'll knock this off if you'll just start doing the pagan things again. Just start going to the pagan festivals again. Start going to the pagan orgies again. Start going to the pagan temple prostitutes again. Start doing these things. It freaks everybody out that you don't do this. Normal people do that. Y'all don't. What's wrong with you? We can't feel at ease so long as you're around. We can't feel at ease at the festivals when you're not there because we don't know what you're planning. We don't know what you're thinking. We don't know what you're plotting. Are you planning to overthrow us? Are you planning to raise up an army? Are you planning a rebellion? Are you planning an insurrection? The attitude of the Roman government essentially was, until we see you worshiping Caesar, worshiping the pagan gods, participating in the pagan festivals where pagan worship is happening, visiting the 13-year-old pagan enslaved temple prostitutes, and so on and so forth, until we see you doing all these things that are normal in our culture, we can't feel confident that you are actually with us, that you are loyal citizens, that you are faithful citizens. And so unless you start to act like pagans again, think like pagans again, live like pagans again, we're going to have to do things like take away your land, kidnap you and torture you, maybe even kill you. We're going to have to destroy your churches. We're going to have to destroy your sect, your religious group completely, unless you guys assimilate into the pagan culture of pagan Rome. That was the mindset of the pagans who surrounded them in Colossae. When Paul says to God's holy people in Colossae, the faithful brothers and sisters in Christ, grace and peace to you from God our Father, he's writing to a group of people who are going through this. And he says, okay, you're under this immense pressure to turn away from the truth of King Jesus and return to pagan gods, pagan mindsets, pagan lifestyles, and pagan attitudes, but you've remained holy. Remember, holy means set apart, essentially. Holy means like you are radically set apart from the fallenness and the brokenness of the world. God has set you apart from the wickedness of the pagan culture of Rome and Colossae. And you've continued to live in a way that is radically set apart from them. That's good. He says, you're the faithful brothers and sisters in Christ. He says, they have poured out this pressure on you to return to all these broken, wicked things. But you have remained faithful. You haven't given up. You haven't walked away from the truth. You haven't just given them what they want. You haven't abandoned faithfulness to Jesus in order to preserve your property, preserve your health, preserve even your life. You've been faithful. So Paul is writing to these faithful Colossian churches who've remained faithful even under intense pressure from the pagan culture and government that surrounds them. But at exactly the same time, they're also under another type of pressure. Because they're also under pressure from the Jewish synagogue in Colossae. So this is a town where many of the Israelites, many of the Jews from the synagogue came to faith and repentance in King Jesus, but at exactly the same time, so many of them did not. Now, some of the ones who did not don't really care. They have a live and let live, right? If they want to worship Jesus, if they want to follow Jesus, if they believe Jesus is that long promised Messiah, then fine. But some of them did not have that live and let live attitude. Some of them had the attitude of those Pharisees and Sadducees who actively railroaded Jesus to the cross, the Sanhedrin members who actively pursued and persecuted Paul all the way to the top until Paul had to appeal to Caesar in the book of Acts and so on and so forth. There were militant types in the Jewish synagogues. There were extremist types in the Jewish synagogue. Ironically, people in the synagogues who were sympathetic towards the revolutionary insurrectionist mindset, right? The Jewish supremacist mindset that wanted to overthrow the Roman government, take over the Roman territories, establish a kind of Israelite empire, and rule over the rest of the Roman Empire's subjects as a kind of Jewish empire, a kind of Israelite Caesar, and so on and so forth. They wanted to be the conqueror after years of being conquered by wicked, the term that the Old Testament prophets and especially Daniel uses to describe kind of evil conquering empires is beasts. An evil conquering empire is a beast. And so, the Babylonian Empire was a beast, and it describes the Babylonian Empire in this beastly way. The Persian Empire is a beast, and they describe the Persian Empire in this beastly way. The Greco-Roman empires, they were beasts, and they described them in these beastly ways, and so on and so forth. They were tired of being chewed up by beasts. They wanted to be the beast. They were tired of getting eaten by lions. They wanted to be the lion. They were tired of getting eaten by wolves. They wanted to be the wolf. And so they spend all this time plotting to overthrow Rome, plotting to overthrow the Gentiles, to enslave the Gentiles the way so many of the Gentiles have enslaved them. And then the Messiah, Jesus, comes, the true king over all creation, comes. And they expect him to lead a rebellion against Rome, to overthrow Rome, to take over Rome. But instead, what does he do? He says, actually, I love the Romans. I love the Gentiles. I love the pagans. I don't want to kill them. I want to save them. I don't want to destroy them. I want to redeem them. I don't want to enslave them. I want to set them free. I want to bring Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female, every tribe and tongue and nation, rich and poor, everyone together into my one flock as the good shepherd, into my one family, into my one kingdom, into my one covenant. And for them, for the revolutionary types in first century Israel, which included many Pharisees, many Sadducees, many in the Sanhedrin, many in the synagogue leadership, and so forth. Not all, but many. That was the worst possible thing he could say. That felt to them like a betrayal of everything they loved and everything they stood for. So They said, we cannot let this man ascend into power. If this man is the Messiah, he will ruin everything. If this man becomes our king, he will ruin everything. If this man leads the covenant, he will ruin everything. They don't even care if he's from God or not. They don't care if he's the Messiah or not. All they care about is he is going to disrupt our plan to seize power over the world, to seize prestige, status, glory, wealth for our people, the Israelites, and subjugate everybody else the way they have subjugated us. And so they rejected Jesus and they rejected everybody who followed him. So once again, I'm not talking about all of the first century Jews. I'm not talking about all of the first century Israelites. A massive portion of the first century Jews and Israelites literally became Christians, became followers of Jesus. Another very large portion of them just didn't really have a strong opinion on Jesus or the early Christians. They just kind of lived their lives. It was live and let live. But a very influential and very powerful group among the first century Israelites, the first century synagogue leaders, viciously opposed King Jesus, his kingdom people, and the kingdom communities that we call churches. And as a result, they were constantly attacking the Christians, constantly dragging the Christians before the pagan rulers and accusing them of different things, constantly doing everything they could, using whatever power was available to them, whatever authority was available to them, whatever resources were available to them, to try to destroy the first century church and to try to pressure, just like the pagans are trying to pressure the churches to come back to pagan gods, pagan mindsets, pagan lifestyles, pagan attitudes. In the same way, so many of the anti-kingdom, anti-Jesus synagogue leaders in the first century were trying to viciously and violently pressure Christians, Jewish Christians, that is, to come back to the old first century distorted Jewish ideology that rejects Jesus and fundamentally warps and distorts what God said in the Old Testament. And at exactly the same time as all of this, there was a group of Jewish Christians, or at least people who considered themselves Christians, called the Judaizers. There was another group called the super apostles, for lack of a better word. Neither of these groups would have called themselves these things. These are terms that Paul and others use to describe them. But they actively tried to distort the gospel within the church to lead the Christians within these early churches away from the truth. And so the church is being attacked from the outside by pagans and by anti-Jesus Israelites, and they're being attacked from within by false teachers such as the Judaizers and the super apostles and others. Very specifically, there were groups of false teachers like the Judaizers who would travel from one church to another throughout the empire, especially churches that Paul had planted. They would falsely claim to be Paul's ministry partners. They would spread lies about Paul. They would distort the gospel that Paul had preached. They would do everything they could to lead the people away from the truth. In some cases, they literally pretended to be Paul's partners. In other cases, they actively tried to turn people against Paul. So remember in 2 Corinthians, the super apostles, they were trying to turn the Corinthian church against Paul, even though he literally converted so many of those people, brought them into the faith, discipled them, was a spiritual father to them. But at the same time, in a lot of other churches, some of the Judaizers also tried to turn people against Paul. Other Judaizers actively pretended to be with Paul. And that seems to be the case here in Colossae. There are false teachers who are pretending to be associates of Paul, pretending to be ministry partners of Paul, pretending maybe that he had discipled them or that they discipled him or that they're in this together and they're saying, no, you misunderstood Paul. Here's what Paul is saying. Say, here's what he actually means. And so Paul says, listen, apart from the apostles themselves, apart from my coworkers that you already know, the only Jewish co-laborers that I have are Aristarchus, Justus, and Mark. He says, any other Jewish preacher or teacher who claims that they're associated with me, whether they are Judaizers or super apostles or anything like that, are lying to you. He says, my fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You have received instructions about Mark. If he comes to you, welcome him. Jesus, who is also called Justus. It's important to understand Jesus or Yeshua or Joshua. That was a very common name at that point in time. And so the name Jesus actually would not have distinguished Jesus very much at all. Jesus was a super common name. I mean, the form that it would have taken at that point in time, which would have been Yeshua or Joshua. Judas was a very common name, and so on and so forth. These were super common names. But so he says, Jesus, who is called Justus, also sends greetings. These are the only Jews among my co-workers for the kingdom of God, and they have proved a comfort to me. Now, when he says these are the only Jews, that doesn't mean literally those are the only Jewish people who are working with him. The point is just, you already know about the other ones. You already know about the apostles. These are the only ones that you don't currently know about. So if anybody who's not Aristarchus, Mark, or Justus comes to you, who is a Jewish Christian who claims that they're my partner, as of this moment, they are not being truthful. They are lying. They are imposters. Now, why does Paul have to specify that? It's because, especially among different forms of Judaizers, they are actively trying to lead the Colossian church astray. Paul says, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. He says, there are false teachers who are trying to tell you, no, if you want to follow Jesus, you have to obey the Mosaic dietary laws from the Old Testament. Even though those dietary laws are over. They served their function and they're done. It's like nobody uses an 8-track anymore because now we have MP3 players, right? The Mosaic dietary restrictions are 8 tracks. They serve their purpose and it's over. He says there are false teachers who are trying to force you to practice all of the Old Testament religious festivals, saying you cannot follow Jesus unless you practice all these festivals. There are false teachers that are trying to force you to gather on the Sabbath day, the old Jewish Sabbath from Friday evening through Saturday evening, even though the point of the Sabbath command has been fulfilled and it's over. It's done. It's gone. He doesn't mention circumcision right here, but he mentions it later. So false teachers are trying to force you to be circumcised Who are they trying to force to be circumcised? Obviously, the Jewish Christians in Colossae are already circumcised, so the Gentiles. Why are they trying to force the Gentiles to be circumcised, to completely change their diet to a point that it would probably actually like make them sick and maybe die, to practice every old Jewish festival, to practice every Sabbath law, every different thing like that? It's actually not about faithfulness to the Lord. We know from Galatians and some of the other writings of Paul that actually the purpose is not any of these things. The purpose is to ban Gentiles from the church. They're trying to raise the barrier of entry to make it impossible for Gentiles to ever actually be part of the church so that the church will be Jewish, not Gentile. It's about Jewish supremacy. So there are three enemies that are attacking the Colossian church. One, the pagans around them, the pagan culture and the pagan government with its persecution. Two, the anti-Jesus synagogue leaders who are trying to pressure them into just coming back to the synagogue, coming back to the false ideology of their version of the Jewish faith. And number three, false teachers like the Judaizers who are trying to bar Gentiles from the church, create a Jewish-only church, a Jewish supremacist church that fundamentally rejects God's heart for every tribe and tongue and nation. And the way that they are doing this is through false ideology. These three different groups, they are trying to bait the Colossians into false ideologies, false philosophies, and so on and so forth. And so in the coming videos, we're going to break down the false worldly philosophies that the Colossian church is constantly being just grilled with and baited towards. But until then, I love you guys. Take care and keep reading.